My name is Garrett Whitmore, and I'm 54 years old. At this stage of life, you'd think I'd have learned to recognize danger when it's staring me in the face. You'd think decades of experience as an investigative journalist would have taught me to trust my instincts. But desperation, it turns out, can make even a seasoned veteran act like a rookie. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about trust, betrayal, and the lengths someone will go for revenge. This is the story of how I met Papa Leo, and how our encounter became one of the most challenging and transformative chapters of my 54 years on this earth. It was 3 years ago, in the autumn of my discontent. I'd just gone through a bitter divorce that had cost me half of everything I'd worked for during my 30-year career. My ex-wife, Patricia, had taken the house in Lincoln Park, a beautiful Victorian we'd restored together over 15 years of marriage, the cabin in Wisconsin where we'd spent countless weekends, and most of our retirement savings. The settlement had been particularly brutal because Patricia's lawyer had successfully argued that my obsessive dedication to work had constituted emotional abandonment. At 51, I found myself living in a cramped studio apartment in Wicker Park, the kind of place I would have scorned in my younger days. The building was old, the radiator clanked constantly, and my neighbors included aspiring musicians who practiced at all hours and college students who threw parties every weekend. It was a humbling experience for someone who had once owned a 4-bedroom house in one of Chicago's most prestigious neighborhoods. The journalism industry had changed dramatically around me while I was focused on my marriage and what I thought was a stable career. Print newspapers were dying slow, painful deaths. Digital media was king, but it was dominated by clickbait headlines and 24-hour news cycles that left no room for the kind of deep, investigative reporting I'd built my reputation on. Editors wanted 25-year-olds who would work for minimal salaries and could produce content at breakneck speed, not grizzled veterans who remembered when journalism was about uncovering truth rather than generating page views. I'd been freelancing for 2 years, taking whatever assignments came my way: celebrity divorce coverage, insurance fraud investigations, missing persons cases, the kind of work that barely covered my alimony payments and kept me in cheap whiskey and instant coffee. My editor at Chicago Magazine, a woman 15 years younger than me named Jessica, would call with assignments that felt more like charity than legitimate journalism. "Garrett, I've got a piece about restaurant health code violations. 2,000 words, due Friday. Standard freelance rate." Standard freelance rate meant $300 for work that would take me the better part of a week to complete properly. But I couldn't afford to turn down any work, no matter how beneath my previous standards it might have been. My body was betraying me in countless small ways that reminded me daily of my advancing age. My back ached constantly from years of hunching over typewriters and later computers, investigating stories that now seemed quaint in their simplicity. My hairline had retreated significantly, revealing a roadmap of stress lines across my forehead that no amount of expensive cream could diminish. The mirror showed me gray stubble that I'd stopped bothering to shave regularly. What was the point when most of my human interaction consisted of phone interviews and email exchanges? My knees protested every morning when I got out of bed. Old football injuries from my high school days in suburban Detroit flaring up whenever the weather turned cold. Getting old, I was learning, wasn't just about wrinkles and gray hair. It was about your body systematically betraying you in ways that made every simple task a reminder of your mortality. My relationship with my daughter Emma had become strained, though not through any lack of love on either side. She was 32, a partner at a prestigious Chicago law firm, married to a good man named David, who coached Little League and remembered my birthday. They had 2 beautiful children, Tyler, 8 years old and sharp as a tack, and Sophie, 6 and full of the kind of wonder that only young children possess. But Emma looked at me with a mixture of love and pity that was harder to bear than outright resentment would have been. She saw what I'd become, a washed-up journalist living in a studio apartment, scraping by on freelance work, unable to move forward with my life. During our monthly dinners, she would carefully avoid asking about my work or my living situation, focusing instead on safe topics like her children's school activities or David's promotion at the accounting firm. "Dad, you know you're always welcome to stay with us if you need to," she'd said more than once, and the kindness in her voice only made the offer more painful to hear. That's when I received an email from someone calling himself Papa Leo. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, when the Chicago wind was already carrying hints of the brutal winter to come. I was sitting in my tiny kitchen, nursing my third cup of coffee and scrolling through job boards, wondering if it was too late to retrain as a bartender or security guard. Something, anything that would provide steady income and benefits. The apartment felt particularly cramped that morning. Boxes of my father's belongings that I'd inherited 2 years earlier were stacked against one wall, still unopened, because I couldn't bear to face the emotional weight of going through a dead man's possessions. My own belongings, what remained after Patricia had taken her half, were crammed into whatever space remained. Books everywhere, because I'd never been able to throw away a book. File cabinets full of old stories, sources, contacts that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the digital age. My laptop was balanced on a small table that served as both desk and dining area. The screen was cracked from a fall 6 months earlier, a repair I couldn't afford, and I'd grown accustomed to reading around the black lines that spider-webbed across the display. When Papa Leo's email appeared in my inbox, it stood out immediately because of its formal tone and the intriguing subject line, an opportunity for restoration. "Mr. Whitmore," the message began, "I have been following your work for some time. You have a reputation for tenacity and integrity, rare qualities in today's media landscape. Your investigation into the Riverside housing project collapse 3 years ago demonstrated exactly the kind of fearless journalism this city needs more of. I have a story that will not only restore your career, but elevate it to heights you've never imagined. This is not hyperbole. What I'm offering you is the story of a lifetime, one that will expose corruption at the very heart of Chicago's power structure. Meet me at Millennium Park tomorrow at 10 p.m. Come alone and bring your recorder. This is the opportunity you've been waiting for. I understand this approach is unconventional, but the nature of what I have to share requires absolute discretion. Time is of the essence, Mr. Whitmore. There are forces at work that will not wait for convenient scheduling. Sincerely, Papa Leo." I stared at the screen for a full minute, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The smart thing, the professional thing, would have been to delete the message immediately. Anonymous sources who demanded nighttime meetings in public places were either cranks or dangerous, and often both. In 30 years of journalism, I'd received dozens of similar messages from conspiracy theorists, attention seekers, and people with genuine mental health issues who believed they were sitting on world-changing information. But attached to the email was a single photograph that made my blood freeze and my hands start shaking. It was a picture of me, taken from across the street, standing outside my apartment building just 2 days earlier. I was holding my mail, wearing the same Cubs jacket I'd had for 15 years, completely unaware I was being watched. The photographer had used a telephoto lens. This wasn't a casual snapshot, but professional surveillance. Someone had been tracking my movements, studying my routines, learning my patterns. The photograph proved that this Papa Leo, whoever he was serious. And if he really did have a story that could salvage what remained of my career, well, desperate men make desperate choices, and I was nothing if not desperate. I spent the rest of that day researching the name Papa Leo online, but found nothing useful. It was too generic, too common. Could be anyone. A nickname, an alias, a code name. I ran searches through newspaper archives, criminal databases, social media platforms, even genealogy sites. Nothing. This man was either using a complete fabrication or was careful enough to stay completely off the digital grid. The more I thought about it, the more intrigued I became. In an age where everyone had a digital footprint, where privacy was virtually non-existent, someone who could operate completely anonymously had to have serious resources and sophisticated knowledge of surveillance techniques. By evening, I'd talked myself into going. I told myself it was just a meeting in a public place, that I'd stay alert, keep my distance, trust my instincts. I was a journalist after all. Risk came with the territory, and I'd covered plenty of dangerous stories over the years. Gang wars on the South Side, political corruption cases where witnesses had a habit of disappearing, organized crime trials where simply showing up in the courtroom could make you a target. Besides, what did I have to lose? My career was already in ruins. My marriage was over. My financial situation was desperate. At 51 with gray hair and a creaking body, I was probably closer to the end of my professional life than the beginning. If this Papa Leo really did have the story of a lifetime, it might be my last chance to do something that mattered. That night, I put on my best remaining suit, a charcoal gray number that Patricia hadn't been able to take in the divorce because it had been a gift from my father years earlier. I'd lost weight since the separation. Stress and a diet of convenience store food having melted away the comfortable middle-aged spread I'd developed during my marriage. So the suit hung looser than it should have. But it still looked professional, and I needed all the confidence I could muster. I drove downtown in my aging Honda Civic, another casualty of the divorce settlement. Patricia had kept the BMW SUV, leaving me with the car we'd bought for Emma when she'd started college a decade earlier. The radio only worked sporadically. The air conditioning had died the previous summer, and there was a mysterious rattle somewhere in the engine that I couldn't afford to have diagnosed. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of snow. Chicago at night has always had a particular quality that I've never experienced in any other city. It's alive but subdued, like a great beast resting between hunts. The lights reflect off Lake Michigan in ways that can be either beautiful or ominous, depending on your mood and the circumstances that brought you out into the darkness. Millennium Park after 10 p.m. is an eerie place. During the day, it's filled with tourists taking selfies in front of Cloud Gate, the gleaming bean sculpture that had become synonymous with Chicago's skyline. Street performers, families enjoying picnics, joggers making their way along the lakefront trail. But after dark, especially on a weeknight in September, it becomes something entirely different. The usual crowds were gone, replaced by the occasional late-night jogger, homeless individuals seeking shelter among the covered areas, and couples taking romantic walks who gave each other wide berth and avoided eye contact. The bean itself became something alien and ominous in the darkness, reflecting distorted images of the city lights that made familiar landmarks look foreign and threatening. I arrived 15 minutes early, positioning myself near the Crown Fountain where I could watch the main approaches to the park. My knees protested the standing, old football injuries from high school that flared up in cold weather. Another reminder that I was no longer the young, invincible reporter who had fearlessly chased stories through Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods. I brought my digital recorder, a notebook, and a pen, the basic tools of my trade, though I wondered if they would be sufficient for whatever Papa Leo had in mind. I'd also brought pepper spray, purchased that afternoon at a sporting goods store, though I hoped I wouldn't need to use it. At exactly 10 p.m., I saw him. He emerged from the shadows near the Lurie Garden like something out of a classic film noir. Tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of bearing that spoke of old money and older power. His hair was perfectly white, not gray, but true silver white, slicked back in a style that belonged to another era entirely. He wore an expensive charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than I made in 3 months of freelance work, and he walked with a silver-tipped walking cane that caught the light with each measured step. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost colorless, like chips of winter ice. They seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. The eyes of a man who had spent decades learning to hide his thoughts behind those Arctic windows to his soul. As he approached, I could see that he was probably in his early 70s, but he moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man. His face was lined but distinguished, the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes with age and authority. He looked like someone who belonged in corporate boardrooms and exclusive private clubs, not lurking in public parks after dark. "You must be Garrett Whitmore," he said as he approached, his voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent I couldn't immediately place. Maybe Eastern European, maybe just old world educated. "Thank you for coming. I know this is unconventional." Up close, I could see expensive details that spoke to his background and resources. His overcoat was cashmere. His shoes were handcrafted leather that gleamed despite the park's dim lighting. And his watch, just visible beneath his coat sleeve, was clearly a Rolex. This was not someone who had contacted me on a whim or as some kind of elaborate prank. "I'm here," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My voice came out steadier than I'd expected, and I was grateful for small mercies. "You said you had a story for me?" Papa Leo smiled, and something about that expression made the temperature seem to drop 10 degrees. It was a perfect smile, too perfect, like he'd practiced it in front of mirrors until he could deploy it like a weapon. There was no warmth in it, no genuine humor or friendliness, just a calculated expression designed to put people at ease while revealing nothing of the man behind it. "Indeed I do," he said, gesturing for me to walk with him deeper into the park. "But first, let me ask you something, Mr. Whitmore. In your 30 years as a journalist, how far have you been willing to go for the truth? What have you sacrificed? What prices have you paid?" It was an interesting question, one that went to the heart of what had driven me through 3 decades of chasing stories. I thought about my marriage, destroyed by long hours and an obsession with work that had left little room for personal relationships. I thought about my relationship with Emma, strained by years of putting stories before family dinners, missing school plays and soccer games because I was chasing leads or conducting interviews. I thought about my health, compromised by years of stress, irregular eating, too much coffee, and too little sleep. I thought about my finances, which had never recovered from taking lower-paying jobs at smaller publications because I refused to compromise my journalistic integrity for corporate-friendly coverage. "Whatever it took," I answered, which was both completely true and, as I would later realize, the beginning of my downfall. Papa Leo nodded approvingly, as if my response confirmed something he'd already suspected about my character. "Good, because what I'm about to show you will test that commitment in ways you cannot yet imagine." We had been walking along one of the park's main paths, our footsteps echoing off the pavement in the crisp night air. Now he stopped beside a bench and reached into his coat, a movement that made me tense, my mind racing through possibilities, ranging from weapons to recording devices to police badges. But he only produced a manila envelope, thick with documents and sealed with wax in an old-fashioned way that suggested ceremony and importance. "Inside," he said, holding the envelope but not yet offering it to me, "you'll find evidence of corruption that reaches into the very heart of this city's power structure. Names, dates, Bank records, photographs, recorded conversations. Everything you need to expose a conspiracy that has been operating for over 20 years. The weight of the envelope, the careful way he handled it, the formal presentation, all of it suggested that whatever was inside represented years of careful documentation and preparation. This wasn't the work of a crank or a conspiracy theorist. This was the work of someone who understood how to build a case that would stand up to legal scrutiny. "What kind of conspiracy?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would be more than I was prepared to handle. "The profitable kind," Papa Leo replied, his pale eyes reflecting the distant streetlights. "The kind where public officials trade human lives for personal gain. The kind where safety regulations become mere suggestions, where building codes become guidelines to be ignored, where the people who are supposed to protect the citizens instead auction them off to the highest bidder." He handed me the envelope, and I could feel the weight of it in my hands. Not just the physical weight of paper and photographs, but the metaphorical weight of whatever secrets it contained. In 30 years of journalism, I'd received plenty of packages from sources promising to expose corruption or reveal hidden truths. Most had contained nothing more than the paranoid fantasies of troubled individuals. But something about Papa Leo's manner, his obvious resources, the professional surveillance photograph he'd sent me, all suggested that this envelope might actually contain the kind of story that could change everything. "The profitable kind," Papa Leo replied, his pale eyes reflecting the distant streetlights. "The kind where public officials trade human lives for personal gain. The kind where safety regulations become mere suggestions, where building codes become guidelines to be ignored, where the people who are supposed to protect the citizens instead auction them off to the highest bidder." He handed me the envelope, and I could feel the weight of it in my hands. Not just the physical weight of paper and photographs, but the metaphorical weight of whatever secrets it contained. In 30 years of journalism, I'd received plenty of packages from sources promising to expose corruption or reveal hidden truths. Most had contained nothing more than the paranoid fantasies of troubled individuals. But something about Papa Leo's manner, his obvious resources, the professional surveillance photograph he'd sent me, all suggested that this envelope might actually contain the kind of story that could change everything. I opened it under the nearest streetlight, and what I saw made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of excitement and dread. The excitement came from recognizing the scope of the story. This was Pulitzer Prize material, the kind of exposé that could resurrect a career and change a city's entire political landscape. The dread came from recognizing one of the names at the center of it all. My father's signature was on dozens of documents. Thomas Whitmore had been Chicago's housing commissioner for 15 years before his death from a heart attack 2 years earlier. I'd always thought of him as one of the good guys, a man who genuinely cared about providing safe, affordable housing for the city's most vulnerable residents. He'd worked his way up from poverty on the South Side, earned his engineering degree at night school while working construction during the day, and had always spoken passionately about giving back to the community that had shaped him. He was my hero, the man who had taught me that journalism was about giving voice to the voiceless and holding the powerful accountable for their actions. When I'd won my first major journalism award, a State Press Association honor for a series about predatory lending practices, he'd been in the front row at the ceremony, beaming with pride. But here, under the harsh glare of a park streetlight, was his signature on contracts that approved substandard construction materials for low-income housing projects. His initials on inspection reports that cleared buildings for occupancy despite obvious safety violations. His name on bank statements showing deposits that had no legitimate source, payments that corresponded exactly with the dates of various housing approvals. The documentation was meticulous and damning. Copies of checks made out to shell companies that traced back to my father's personal accounts. Photographs of him meeting with known associates of various criminal organizations. Recorded phone conversations where he discussed specific building projects and the payments he would receive for ensuring their approval. "This can't be real," I whispered. But even as I said it, I could see the careful cross-referencing, the photographic evidence, the chain of documentation that would be impossible to fabricate convincingly. This wasn't amateur hour work. This was the product of someone who understood how to build an airtight legal case. Papa Leo studied my reaction with those pale eyes, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was cataloging my responses for future use. "Oh, but it is quite real, Mr. Whitmore. Your father was instrumental in my operations for many years. A reliable partner in various business ventures until—" "Until what?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "Until he developed what some might call a conscience. In his final months, your father began to have second thoughts about our arrangement. He spoke of exposure, of testimony, of making amends for past mistakes. He became what we in my business call a liability." The implication hit me like a physical blow, making me stagger backward and nearly drop the envelope. "You're saying you had something to do with his death?" Papa Leo's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those ice-blue eyes. A momentary flash of what might have been pride or satisfaction. "I'm saying that a man of your father's age, under the stress of a guilty conscience, might naturally suffer from heart problems. Hearts are fragile things, Mr. Whitmore. They can stop quite suddenly when subjected to the right kind of pressure." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. My father had died of a massive heart attack while working late in his office, reviewing housing project proposals that would later be approved by his successor. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest brought on by years of high blood pressure, stress, and a family history of heart disease. But now this man was suggesting something far more sinister. "You're talking about deliberate harm," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about business, Mr. Whitmore. Nothing more, nothing less. Your father created a problem, and problems require solutions. Sometimes those solutions are permanent." The casual way he discussed my father's death, the complete absence of remorse or even acknowledgement that we were talking about a human life, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the September evening air. "What do you want from me?" "An excellent question." Papa Leo began walking again, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement in a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet park. "You see, Mr. Whitmore, your father's untimely death solved one problem but created another. His files were incomplete when authorities secured his office. Certain documents went missing from his desk and file cabinets before police could conduct their investigation. We were walking deeper into the park now, away from the main paths and the occasional late-night jogger or couple taking a romantic stroll. The city lights seemed farther away, the shadows deeper and more threatening. "I suspect," Papa Leo continued, "that your father may have hidden evidence, insurance policies, recordings, the sorts of things a guilty man might collect to protect himself should circumstances change. And I suspect that if he did leave behind any such problematic materials, he might have found a way to get them to the one person he trusted above all others." I thought about the boxes of my father's personal effects that I'd inherited after his death. They were sitting in my cramped studio apartment, unopened and untouched for 2 years, because I'd been too emotionally devastated to deal with the pain of going through a dead man's possessions. Family photographs, awards and certificates, personal correspondence, tools from his construction days, before he'd become a city official, all the detritus of a life that had ended too suddenly for proper goodbyes or final conversations. Even if he did leave something behind, I said, why would I help you? You just told me you were responsible for his death. Papa Leo stopped walking and turned to face me, his pale eyes reflecting the distant streetlights like a predator's. In the dim light, his distinguished features looked carved from stone, and I could see the kind of cold intelligence that had probably served him well in whatever business he was actually involved in. Because, my dear Garrett, may I call you Garrett? You don't really have a choice in the matter. He reached into his coat again and produced a second envelope, this one thinner, but somehow more ominous in its implications. The photographs inside were surveillance images, taken with professional equipment by someone who clearly knew how to remain invisible while documenting his subjects' daily routines. Emma coming out of her law firm in downtown Chicago, her briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other, completely unaware she was being watched. David loading groceries into their car in the parking lot of their local supermarket. Tyler and Sophie visible in the back seat, their faces animated with the kind of innocent happiness that only children possess. More photographs showing my grandchildren playing in their backyard, riding their bikes in the neighborhood, waiting at the school bus stop with their friends. Recent photographs. Very recent photographs. Beautiful family, Papa Leo said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the systematic surveillance of innocent people. Emma inherited your intelligence, I see. Graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern Law. Made partner at Kirkland & Ellis in record time. David seems like a good man. Steady job at the accounting firm. Loves his children. Coaches Tyler's Little League team on weekends. He took the photograph back and slipped them into his coat with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling sensitive materials. And the children? Well, children are the most precious things in the world, aren't they? So full of potential, so vulnerable, so fragile. My hands were shaking as I processed the implications of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a threat, it was a demonstration of capability. A clear message that Papa Leo and his organization had the resources and willingness to reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. "You son of a bitch," I said, my voice tight with rage and fear. Now, there's no need for profanity. I'm simply illustrating the scope of my resources and the depth of my commitment to resolving this situation satisfactorily. His tone remained conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made his words more terrifying than outright threats would have been. You see, Garrett, I built my organization very carefully over many years. Your father's cooperation was essential to that process, and his betrayal threatened everything I'd worked for. When someone threatens my business interests, I take that very personally. Papa Leo gestured toward a secluded bench surrounded by trees, far from any of the park's main walkways. When I hesitated, he smiled that perfect, terrible smile again. Please, Garrett, we have so much more to discuss, and I'd prefer that we both be comfortable for this conversation. I sat, mainly because my knees were starting to ache from standing and walking, and my back was sending shooting pains down my legs. Getting old, I reflected bitterly, was a process of constant physical betrayal, your body reminding you daily of your mortality and limitations. 3 weeks after your father's unfortunate heart attack, Papa Leo continued, settling beside me with the grace of a man half his age. You published an article about the Riverside housing project collapse. Do you remember it? I remembered it vividly. It had been one of my better pieces of investigative work in recent years, a comprehensive examination of the collapse of a low-income housing building that had killed 15 people, including 3 children. I'd spent weeks interviewing survivors, digging through building permits and inspection records, tracing the money trail that led from initial construction contracts through various city agencies and private contractors. The building had been constructed using substandard materials, cheap concrete that cracked under load, electrical wiring that didn't meet code requirements, plumbing that backed up regularly and created unsanitary conditions throughout the structure. The heating system was inadequate for Chicago winters, leaving residents to choose between paying impossible utility bills or living in dangerously cold conditions. When the building finally collapsed during a January ice storm, investigators found evidence of systematic corner cutting throughout the construction process. Load-bearing walls that weren't actually load-bearing, foundations that had been poured with the wrong concrete mixture, fire exits that had been blocked or sealed to create additional rental space. It was exactly the kind of story I'd built my reputation on: detailed, thoroughly researched, relentlessly focused on holding powerful people accountable for decisions that affected the most vulnerable members of society. The article had won several state journalism awards and had led to investigations by federal housing authorities. "I remember," I said. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything, as it turns out." Papa Leo's voice took on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to a particularly slow student. "You see, the Riverside project was one of mine. One of the buildings your father approved through his position with the Housing Commission. The substandard materials, the ignored safety violations, the bribes that made it all possible, that was my handiwork." My stomach dropped as I began to understand the connections he was drawing. "You're saying I helped expose my own father's corruption without knowing it?" "Precisely. Your investigation was quite thorough, I must say. You traced the money trail, interviewed the right people, asked all the correct questions. You cost me several $1 million in contracts and damaged some very important business relationships. Government officials don't like to work with people who can't control their operations effectively." The irony was almost unbearable. I had spent weeks investigating a story that exposed the very corruption my father had been involved in, never knowing that I was documenting his crimes along with everyone else's. The building collapse I had written about so passionately, the 15 deaths I had used to illustrate the human cost of construction fraud, had been enabled by my own father's willingness to take bribes. "Good," I said, with more courage than I actually felt. "I hope it destroyed your entire operation." Papa Leo laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to echo unnaturally in the quiet park. "Oh, my dear boy, you still don't understand the situation you're in, do you? I wasn't ruined by your article, merely inconvenienced, but it did create a problem that needs to be solved." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where federal investigators start asking uncomfortable questions. The kind where other journalists follow up on your initial reporting, digging deeper into records that should remain buried. The kind where my business partners start wondering if I can be trusted to handle sensitive operations discreetly." Papa Leo checked an expensive watch, the Rolex I'd noticed earlier, which probably cost more than I made in 6 months of freelance work. "You see, there are still people asking questions about the Riverside collapse. Federal housing investigators, FBI agents looking into construction fraud patterns, journalists hoping to build on your initial reporting. It's becoming quite bothersome for my ongoing operations." "Then maybe you should find a different line of work," I suggested. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. I have investors, employees, ongoing obligations, people who depend on me for their livelihoods, if you will. When you disrupted my business with your article, you didn't just cost me money. You put a lot of people in very difficult positions." The way he spoke about his criminal organization, like a legitimate business, complete with employees and investors who needed protection, would have been almost comical, if not for the underlying menace in his tone and the photographs of my family that were burning in my memory. "Here's what's going to happen," Papa Leo said, his voice taking on a more formal tone that suggested we were moving from exposition to actual demands. "You're going to write a follow-up story to your Riverside article. This new piece will reveal that you've uncovered additional evidence showing that the corruption went deeper than anyone suspected. I was beginning to see where this was going, and I didn't like the direction at all. You'll expose your father as the mastermind behind a systematic scheme to approve dangerous buildings in exchange for substantial kickbacks. You'll show how he used his position as housing commissioner to enrich himself while putting thousands of Chicago residents at risk. I won't do it, I said immediately. You will, because the alternative is unacceptable. Papa Leo's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath it now. Your daughter works late most nights, often alone in her office on the 32nd floor. David jogs alone every morning at 6 a.m. along the lakefront. The children walk 3 blocks to school each day, often without adequate adult supervision. He paused to let that sink in, watching my face carefully, as if gauging the effectiveness of his words. Accidents happen every day in Chicago, Garrett. Cars lose control on icy streets. Gas lines develop leaks in old buildings. Electrical fires start without warning in high-rise office buildings. This is a dangerous city, full of aging infrastructure and unpredictable hazards. The casual way he discussed potential violence against my family, the complete absence of emotion or acknowledgement that we were talking about innocent people, made my blood freeze. I could see in his pale eyes that he wasn't making empty threats. This was a man who had clearly done terrible things before and would do them again without hesitation. You're talking about innocent people, children. I'm talking about business incentives, Garrett. Nothing more, nothing less. You created a problem for me, and now I need you to solve it. Your father becomes the scapegoat for everything that went wrong with the Riverside Project and dozens of other similar situations. The federal heat dies down. My business operations continue, and you get the story of a lifetime. Everyone wins, except my father's memory and reputation. Your father made his choices, just as you're about to make yours. He chose to cooperate with me for 15 years, taking payments and approving dangerous projects. Then he chose to betray me, and he paid the price for that decision. The only question now is whether you want your family to pay the same price for your stubbornness. Papa Leo stood up, straightening his expensive coat with the careful precision of a man accustomed to maintaining appearances regardless of circumstances. The silver tip of his walking cane caught the light as he prepared to leave me with what might be the most difficult decision of my life. "It's getting late," he said, checking that expensive watch again. "And we both have busy days tomorrow. I'm going to give you 48 hours to think about my proposal. If that article exposing your father isn't published by midnight on Thursday, well, I'm afraid the consequences will be quite severe." He began walking back toward the park's main entrance, his footsteps eerily quiet on the pavement despite the silver-tipped cane. After a few steps, he paused and turned back toward me. "One more thing, Garrett. I know what you're thinking. Go to the police. Contact the FBI. Turn this into a federal case. I wouldn't recommend it. I've been operating in this city for over 20 years, and I have friends in very high places. Friends who owe me favors. Friends who share my business interests. Friends who wouldn't appreciate having their own arrangements exposed to public scrutiny." The implication was clear. Papa Leo's corruption network extended into law enforcement itself, making any official complaint potentially dangerous for both me and my family. "You can't own everyone," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not everyone, but enough of the right people to ensure that any complaint you might make would be misplaced. Evidence would disappear, witnesses would recant their statements, and you'd find yourself the subject of some very uncomfortable investigations into your own past." He smiled that perfect smile again, the expression that managed to be both charming and terrifying. Instead of complying with Papa Leo's ultimatum, I made the hardest decision of my career. I went home, retrieved my father's hidden documents from storage, and spent the next 36 hours building the real story. Not the one Papa Leo wanted, but the truth about his entire criminal network. My father had documented everything: recordings, photographs, financial records. He'd been planning to expose Papa Leo before his conscience and the stress killed him. Now I would finish what he'd started. I sent copies of everything to multiple news outlets, law enforcement agencies, and legal contacts simultaneously. By Thursday evening, Papa Leo was arrested at the airport trying to flee the country. The FBI had been tracking his movements since my story broke across every major network. The trials took 2 years. Papa Leo was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison. My exposé won journalism awards and led to comprehensive reforms in Chicago's building inspection and oversight systems. But the story didn't end there. 18 months later, Papa Leo's grandson, Marcus Romano, attempted to continue his grandfather's work and threatened my family for revenge. However, modern law enforcement cooperation and digital surveillance made his old-school intimidation tactics ineffective. The FBI apprehended Marcus before he could act on any threats. Years later, when Papa Leo died of natural causes in federal prison, I felt no satisfaction, only closure. The corrupt networks had been dismantled and replaced with better oversight systems. The city had become safer for its most vulnerable residents. I remarried a wonderful woman named Sarah, who worked in housing advocacy. At 60, I found peace I never expected to experience. Emma and I rebuilt our relationship, and I became a grandfather who was actually present for his grandchildren's lives. The experience taught me that journalism isn't about perfect heroes defeating absolute villains. It's about imperfect people trying to do right in a complex world, taking responsibility for both the intended and unintended consequences of their choices. Papa Leo built something harmful that needed to be stopped. My father made serious mistakes, but ultimately tried to make amends. I did my job as a journalist, though not without personal cost. The most important outcome wasn't my career restoration or Papa Leo's downfall. It was the institutional changes that now protect families from similar harm. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply ensuring that the next generation faces fewer dangers than the one before. At 63, I'm now retired, but occasionally write about ethics and accountability in public service. The truth about Papa Leo wasn't just about exposing one man's crimes. It was about building systems that serve everyone, not just the powerful.